Today, 22nd June 2023, is, by my calculations, the 19th day of Ukraine's offensive in the southern regions of Ukraine. Of course, the Russians claim these are now Russian territories, but I will stick to the convention that they are the southern regions of Ukraine in Zaporozhye and southern Donbass. And it is also the anniversary of the attack on 22nd June 1941 of the German military and of Germany's allies. And it's important to say that Germany had a significant number of allies at that time in Europe against the Soviet Union, which initiated the 4-year war between Germany and the Soviet Union, by far the most titanic struggle, military struggle in human history, and one which in the end, after extraordinary violence and suffering, led to the final defeat of Germany and the capture of Berlin by the Red Army. And this is, of course, an enormously important event in Russian history. The war touched on every Russian family. The Soviet Union suffered 27 million losses. That's the official number over the course of the war. Number of people killed. Many more people were wounded. Many more people were traumatized as a result of that war. And though, of course, today's Russia is not the entirety of the Soviet Union, it is only a part of the Soviet Union, which Germany attacked on the 22nd of June 1941. It is Russia which, by all accounts, absorbed much the greater part of these casualties. So it is a huge event in Russian history, a tremendously traumatic event for Russians, and it's one that they remember extremely well, and which to a very great extent still informs their outlook on international relations to an extent that Westerners rarely ever seem to grasp. Partly, I suspect, because the full extent and horror of the war between the Russians had to fight between 1941 and 1945 has never been properly recognized in the West. Anyway, any discussion of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, any attempt to define Russian actions without taking this colossal event in the not so distant past into account is inherently flawed. And I'm not saying that the war that began for the Russians on the 22nd of June 1941 provides the entire explanation for the present conflict, but it certainly provides a significant part of that explanation insofar as Russians are concerned, in that it is, from their point of view, another conflict involving the West encroaching on historical Russian territories, which the Russians perceive themselves as defending. Now, there may not be an interpretation that many people in the West will accept, but it's not a question of whether the interpretation is one that should be accepted or not. It is the fact that it is the interpretation that most Russians hold and which affects the way they view this conflict. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about this conflict today. Just to say again that for the Russians, there is a direct continuum between that conflict in the 1940s and the one that is being fought out in Ukraine now. Now, what has in fact been happening over the previous 24 hours, over the fighting that has been happening in the current conflict in Ukraine? Well, I'm going to start with some words of President Putin's. And he answered a question from a journalist. We're not told which journalist, and we're told that this incident took place we're told that this particular incident took place on the 21st of June, yesterday in other words, but we're not entirely informed, we're not properly informed as to exactly where it happened. It happened in the Kremlin, but we don't quite know why or in what context. Perhaps it was related to, most probably it was related to a meeting of graduates of higher military schools that Putin addressed in the Gergiev Hall. But anyway, there is something slightly mysterious about this exchange, and that makes me think that it was probably prearranged. Anyway, it gave Putin an opportunity to discuss the current state of the conflict, and I'm going to read out the whole question and answer. It's relatively short. This is the version that appears on the Kremlin's website in the official translation. And so the question is, how do you generally assess the progress in the special operation at the moment, and what is the current situation in view of Ukraine's counteroffensive? And Putin replied, I already spoke about this, and it is a well-known fact. The Ukrainian armed forces launched the counteroffensive on June 4th using their strategic reserves. Oddly enough, it is a slow burn at the moment because the enemy is sustaining serious personnel and equipment losses. As of last night, or this early morning to be exact, our men have taken down 245 tanks and about 678 armoured vehicles of different types, to say nothing of the enemy's personnel losses, which are very significant. Now, before I proceed, I would say that Western translations of Putin's words, and some Russian ones, have referred to Putin talking about a lull, some kind of operational pause. The Kremlin's translation is different. It uses the word slow burn at the moment. In other words, that perhaps there's a less intense fighting than there's been at other times, but Putin here is at pains to point out that the fighting is still underway, and that he's not actually talking about a pause or anything like that. And then Putin goes on to say this: apparently the enemy is busy putting together new divisions out of brigades that sustained serious losses and is restoring its combat capacity. Of course, the enemy is wary of similarly large losses in the future, because it might not just lead to it losing its combat effectiveness, or to be exact, leads to losing not only its offensive potential, but the army's combat readiness in general. They have something to rack their brains about. So Putin's comment is this: at the beginning, when the offensive was first launched, Ukraine was launching big frontal attacks on Russian positions. It was absorbing, taking very heavy consequences in doing so, very heavy losses in doing so, and that was putting in jeopardy the functionality of the entire Ukrainian military. It wasn't just that the Ukrainians were losing men and machines at such speed that they would not be able to continue with their offensive. Rather, it was a case of the Ukrainians losing men and machines at such a rate that their entire army might cease to be a viable force on the battlefields. So, they're in the process of changing their tactics. They're trying to find ways of continuing with their offensive, without experiencing heavy losses, similarly heavy losses. But that does mean that the nature of their attacks has become less intense, and that is why the offensive is now a slow burn. It's not quite a lull, but it's a slow burn. It's an offensive that will continue for many weeks and months, as he goes on to say further down in his comments. But it doesn't mean that Ukraine has abandoned it, and it doesn't mean that there's a pause at the moment. What it means is that the Ukrainians have switched tactics from an all-out frontal assault intended to break through quickly towards more careful attacks involving smaller groups of men and machines trying still to break through, but this time not prepared to accept the enormously heavy losses of the first few days. And he goes on to say, as of today, we see that this offensive potential is not exhausted. The enemy still has reserves, and it is considering how best to employ them and where. I have said it, but I will repeat, thanks to the courage and heroism of our troops and our commander's readiness to repulse any aggressive actions against Russia, I believe the enemy stands no chance. They realize that, and that is why they're stalled, although occasional combat incidents are taking place, such as shelling and combat reconnaissance missions. But again, their offensive is not in its active phase yet. So they haven't given up. They've changed their tactics. They're hammering on the door. But sooner or later, they will try something bigger again once they've decided how they're going to go about it in a way that will not repeat the disasters of the first 2 weeks. And then Putin is again asked the question, is the number of taken down Western machines also growing? And Putin says, of course it is growing. The question is how many we have hit. I need to check the latest figures. As of last night, it was 245 tanks, and as I said, 678 armoured vehicles of different types. Of course, some of them are Leopards, some are French and US armoured vehicles. They are burning like crazy. Anyway, those are Putin's words. So, Ukraine is still conducting its offensive. The offensive has not ended. The Ukrainians still have significant forces that they could throw into the attacks. For the moment, they're attacking in smaller numbers, trying to find weak points on the Russian lines. But a big attack at some point is bound to happen. And the Russians are waiting for it, and Putin is confident that when the big attack comes, the Russians will be able to surmount it. Anyway, that's what he's saying. And of course, he's also saying that in the meantime, Western equipment continues to be knocked out, as well as including Leopards and French and US armoured vehicles, Bradleys and such things. And by the way, the Russian Defense Ministry yesterday, I think for the first time, claimed that German Marder infantry fighting vehicles have also been destroyed. But anyway, one way or the other, the offensive is not over. Ukraine is still taking heavy losses. And if his figures are correct, and Ukraine has indeed lost 245 tanks over the course of 19 days, then that is a catastrophic rate of loss. There's some suggestions that at the beginning of this offensive, Ukraine had perhaps 800 tanks in total, of which around 250 were donated by the West specifically for this offensive. Well, if that is correct, then Ukraine has lost something like a third of its total number of tanks. Anyway, that's what Putin is saying. Now, Other Russian officials have been saying much the same thing. Our old friend Vladimir Rogov today described the situation on the battlefronts, and he said, as of now, the overwhelming part of the Ukrainian forces are near the first defense line or in the grey zone, failing to seize even our forward defense positions. This is a reason for cautious optimism, but one must understand that the battle is still ahead as the enemy has not yet engaged the main reserves. And TASS, from where I take this, goes on to say that Rogov says that the main battle with the Ukrainian army will take place this summer. So sometime this summer, the Ukrainians will try to activate their remaining reserves and will launch whatever big attack it is that they have in mind. They failed to break through in Zaporozhye region up to now, but they will try something else. And we might have had a clue today as to what that else might be, because over the last 24 hours, Ukraine struck two bridges linking Crimea with Kherson region. And again, I'm quoting Vladimir Rogov. He says that these two bridges were the Chongar Bridge and another bridge over the Bay of Sivash. And this has appeared on his Telegram channel. And both of these bridges were struck with British Storm Shadow missiles, according to Rogov. Now, the second bridge, the bridge over the Bay of Sivash, according to Rogov, is actually not working. It's not being used. It's derelict. It's an old, unused bridge. It's not being used anymore. The Chongar Bridge is used, though again Russian officials hasten to assure us that this bridge is not playing any significant role in the special military operation. It doesn't provide the supplies that the Russian troops in Zaporozhye depend upon, which I suspect, by the way, are not being sent to these troops via Ukraine. They're probably being sent to some extent directly along the railway lines and road lines from Russia across the so-called land bridge. So anyway, that's what Rogov is saying. There's been pictures that have been released of the damage on the Chongar Bridge. It's some, frankly, superficial damage to the road surface. The Russians say that the bridge will be back in operation within days, and I have to say it does look like this. It doesn't seem as if this was a strike, that it achieved very much. But the fact that the Ukrainians are now reverting to the practice that they followed at the time of the offensive in Kherson, of trying to attack bridges in order to cut Russian supply lines, the Antonovsky Bridge primarily in that case, that may suggest that the Ukrainians are reviving the plan to launch an amphibious assault across the Dnieper River into Kherson region, and that they think that by attacking these bridges, they're affecting Russian communications between Crimea and Kherson. Now, the Russians have fortified this area very heavily. They built up very, very extensive fortifications. And I would have thought that it would be much more difficult this time to repeat what Ukraine was trying to do in Kherson. I mean, I should say that even during the Kherson offensive, it's now clear that Ukrainian HIMARS attacks on the Antonovsky Bridge never did as much damage to the bridge as was reported, so that the bulk of the Russian forces that were in Kherson region actually evacuated Kherson region by travelling across it. So and this attack, as I said, on a less important bridge seems to have done only superficial damage. But anyway, this could be where the fact that the Ukrainians are attacking these bridges, it could be that they are falling back on the same plan that they had, that they used when they launched their offensive in Kherson region, though I suspect with much less prospect this time of success. Now, the other thing that may point to this being the ultimate focus of Ukrainian attacks, Kherson region, the east bank of Kherson region, is the Ukrainian attacks on that small village of Piatikhatki, which is, as I said yesterday, is on the far western edge of the Russian fortified lines in this area. And there was a lot more fighting around Piatikhatki yesterday. The Ukrainians, some days ago, on the 19th of June, early on the 19th of June, released a photo of their troops occupying Piatikhatki and unfurling the Ukrainian flag there. There was then a Russian counterattack later that day on the 19th. Fighting over Piatikhatki has gone backwards and forwards ever since. It seems the Ukrainians have suffered very, very heavy losses trying to capture Piatikhatki, but yesterday we were told that the Russians launched a major counterattack in and around Piatikhatki and finally and conclusively recaptured the village, which is now definitively back under Russian control. Now, this heavy emphasis by Ukraine on trying to capture Piatikhatki, I said yesterday that it could be connected with Ukraine trying to push towards the big Russian fortified lines in this area, in conjunction with a plan eventually perhaps to try to capture these, break through these fortifications when they're eventually reached, in conjunction with some kind of amphibious assault across the Dnieper. And it could be, again, that the attacks on the bridges, the Chongar Bridge and the other bridge over the Sivash, and this attack, as I said, at Piatikhatki, might all point in that direction. Well, we shall see. We shall see what the Ukrainians eventually do. But for the moment, the story about their offensive is that it is at a standstill. They have not broken through anywhere along the front lines. As Putin correctly says, they've taken very heavy losses. They've not managed to clear the Vremevka ledge. The Russian troops still occupy the heights there and several of the villages. And in Orekhov, where Ukraine, near the south of the town of Orekhov, where the Ukrainians launched another attack this morning, again using apparently Leopard 2 tanks and other vehicles. Again, that attack was repelled by the Russian forces, and again, the Ukrainians experienced significant casualties. Though I'm not going to try and speculate up to now exactly how many. But for the moment, at least, the Ukrainian offensive is at a standstill, though both Putin, who's obviously the man in the know, and Rogov, who is a local official, both think that Ukraine has not given up, and they're going to eventually, as they try to hammer away at these Russian defences that they're going to come up with something bigger further along, and it could be some kind of crossing of the Dnieper in conjunction with an advance towards the Russian fortified lines via Piatichatki on the east bank of the Dnieper. We shall see. Anyway, that's all for the future. For the moment, Ukrainian defences are at a standstill, and even President Zelensky has now admitted that the situation is, the offensive is not going as fast, and by implication, not as well as Ukraine hoped. So that, it seems to me, is the overall situation on the battlefronts. There were more Russian missile and drone attacks across Ukraine yesterday, but if we're talking about Russian actions, it's now increasingly clear that the main drama is to the north, with reports of further Russian advances in the area of Kupyansk, and yesterday of a major, very rapid advance by several kilometers apparently by the Russian 76th Airborne Division towards Liman. Liman was a small town which the Russians captured in May. It's part of the Slavyansk conurbation. Russians held it until, I think it was late October, maybe early November, when it reverted to its old Soviet name of Krasny Liman. The Ukrainians were then able to recapture it in what was the last success of their Kharkov offensive. It was the furthest point that they were able to capture. And I say capture, in fact, they were held up there for something like 3 weeks against a small garrison of around 500 Russian troops, who consisted, by the way, mainly of Russian volunteer units. They were not regular Russian, most of them were not regular Russian military, but nonetheless, it took Ukraine something like 3 weeks to capture Liman, but Ukraine did eventually capture it, and the Russians seem to be moving back towards Liman. And whether they are intending at the moment to recapture it, only time can tell. But Simplikis the thinker has done another of his very interesting sit-reps, in which he's summarized very in much detail the fighting that's going on in this part of the world, in Kupyansk, near Kupyansk. His piece was clearly written before the most recent reports about the advance on Liman itself. But he suggests that, especially with the Russians now having made significant advances over the course of the winter and spring in central areas of Donbass, capturing Bakhmut most importantly, that it would make sense for the Russians to regain the territories that they lost in the autumn to Ukraine's counteroffensive, to retake ETHEREUM and Balakleya, and of course Kupyansk, and of course Liman, because the Russians can then bring Slavyansk itself, this big town, which is the main center of Ukrainian defenses in northern Donbass, brings Slavyansk into a semicircle, and of course with Bakhmut now under Russian control, and perhaps Siversk eventually falling under Russian control, that will put the Russians in a strong position, stronger position than before, because they've got so many more troops to advance and capture Slavyansk, which would of course be a perhaps terminal blow for Ukraine in trying to hold on to the rest of Donbass. And of course, the advances in Kupyansk and Liman are also being linked by some people to Putin's words about establishing a cordon sanitaire to protect Russian territory from Ukrainian cross-border raids and Ukrainian shelling. I think that is to read too much into these events, but who's to say? We shall see. Perhaps that's a more logical plan for several months ahead. The Russians have to deal firstly with this Ukrainian offensive, which is still ongoing, and they have to also, first of all, before they can even consider establishing cordons sanitaires, they need to complete the capture of, or recapture of places like Kupyansk and Liman and those things. And only then, I think, does it become appropriate to talk about larger Russian plans with respect to Kharkiv region and Kharkiv city itself. So anyway, that's the overall situation on the battlefronts. There's not been very much more in terms of the political and diplomatic discussions that also take place in connection with the war. NATO does seem to be cranking up now, however, for its meeting in Vilnius. And Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, has again made it clear that as far as he's concerned, there is no prospect of Ukraine being offered NATO membership or even a timetable for NATO membership in Vilnius. And most bizarrely, Scholz has also said that NATO will continue to support Ukraine, but it will also try to ensure that the war doesn't expand and there isn't a further escalation of the war beyond Ukraine. Now, I have to say, I find Scholz's comments on this really very strange, and it does seem to me that he appears to be wanting to have, if you like, his cake and eat it as well. He seems to think that NATO is free to escalate limitlessly in terms of weapon supplies to Ukraine, and at the same time he thinks that that doesn't somehow make NATO a kind of co-belligerent in this war. The Russians, as I said previously, as I said with Shoigu's warning of a few days ago about striking at decision-making centers in Ukraine if attacks take place with Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles on Russian territories, which would, by the way, include Crimea. If the Russians might see things differently from the way that Scholz sees them or wants to see them. And it does seem to me somewhat, shall we say, unrealistic of Scholz, I'm being polite here, to think that he's able to control the situation in the way that, he can escalate up to a certain point and the Russians won't escalate and everything will remain neat and tidy and Germany will be left unscathed, even as this war in Ukraine continues in the way that it is. But I do get the sense that Western leaders often, at least especially European leaders, often do overestimate their ability to influence events. They don't seem to understand that the decisions are not ultimately being made by them, but by people in Moscow and Washington, and that they are, to a great extent, now trapped on the train that they embarked they climbed onto at the start of this conflict, and that they're not driving the train any longer. But there we are. Scholz continues to have these illusions, because I think they are illusions. And I think other European leaders have their illusions as well. And Emmanuel Macron, as I've said previously, tried to get himself an invitation to the BRICS summit in South Africa. The Russians have essentially vetoed that. I've said that previously that I'm fairly sure that Macron's purpose in trying to get himself an invitation to the BRICS summit was that he was hoping to speak with Putin there. He was trying to get through to Putin, something which Scholz has been trying to do, Macron probably has also been trying to do, but Putin hasn't been interested. And I think he was hoping that if he could get an invitation to the BRICS summit, then he, Macron, might be able to get a meeting with Putin there. Anyway, the Russians have said that, and this is from the Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, we have sent a signal that, with all due respect to the prerogatives of South Africa as the host to invite individual guests, it is necessary to proceed from the fact that BRICS is an alliance of countries that categorically rejects the use of unilateral sanctions for resolving foreign policy issues. Given this, the presence of Western officials, including by implication Macron, would clearly be inappropriate there. So I think that is the Russians basically telling the South Africans, don't invite Macron, we're not interested in a meeting with him, and I am sure the South Africans will agree. So it doesn't look as if Macron is going to get his invitation, and it's strange that he ever thought that he would. But there we are. As I said, illusions always run strong. And for the record, I think that the only Western leader that Putin would be prepared to speak to at this time would be President Biden of the United States. And this is not because I think he trusts Biden at all, but I think it is because Putin has come to see Biden and essentially no one else in the West, no other leader in the West, as an effective policy maker. So whether or not Biden does call Putin, I have no idea. Robert Kennedy Jr. has suggested that he should, but Biden seems to show no particular interest in doing it. But anyway, for the moment, there is no sign of that call. And for the moment, I don't expect it's going to happen. But in the meantime, Scholz and Macron might want to speak with Putin, but Putin clearly isn't interested in speaking with them. Putin's approach is that he might be prepared to talk to the organ grinder, but he's not going to waste time with the organ grinder's monkey. So that's I think where we are with the diplomacy at the moment. Now, there are other potential and potentially worrying developments. There's been some reports that the major training for the F-16, the Ukrainian F-16 pilots, is going to happen in Romania, and that it's going to be, Romania is going to become the hub, in other words, for training the Ukrainian F-16 pilots. There's lots of confusion about whether this training has begun or not. Stoltenberg thinks that it has. Others think that it hasn't. Most likely it's supposed to begin in August. But note that Romania is the closest place to Crimea, And it does make one wonder whether the ultimate intention is not just to train the Ukrainian pilots in Romania, but to operate the F-16s from Romania so that they can establish some kind of air cover over Crimea itself, penetrate, in other words, as far as Crimea and the Kherson battlefields, on the assumption that the fighting there is not going to be over by then. And again, I would remind everyone of that warning that Putin gave, that the Russians are thinking hard about what might happen if F-16s operate against Russian positions, but do so from NATO bases in a NATO country. And he strongly hinted that in that case, Russia might be prepared to take action against those bases. And I think that this is a dangerous moment for Romania. I wonder whether the Romanian authorities are fully on board with what the plans might be. And I wonder whether the Romanian people have been informed about them as well. But anyway, that's a serious development, and one which will presumably begin to acquire serious importance in the autumn, when these F-16s, piloted presumably by these hastily trained Ukrainian pilots, first start to appear. Now, I have to say that there are good reasons for doubting that these F-16s are going to achieve very much anyway. There was a very interesting article on CNN in which Ukrainian pilots admitted that their planes, their MiG-29s and Sukhoi 25s and Sukhoi 27s, are now being systematically shot out of the skies by Russian aircraft, and that the Russian aircraft, the Sukhoi 35s especially, they always seem to be the ones that people focus mostly upon, that the Sukhoi 35s are much more advanced than the Ukrainian aircraft, which are leftovers from the Soviet times, and that the Russians are able to shoot them down without much difficulty from long ranges with standoff missiles from these much more powerful and much more advanced Russian fighters. Now, a lot of people in Ukraine have developed this idea that the F-16s might somehow change this dynamic. I've read many American commentators who have knowledge about these things, who doubt that they can do. And of course, it's important again to reiterate that the F-16 is a relatively old aircraft. In terms of it, the original version was developed in the 1970s. It entered service with the US Air Force in, I believe, 1978. It actually predates the MiG-29 and the Sukhoi 27, which are the mainstays of Ukraine's Air Force. And apparently the F-16s that are going to be delivered to Ukraine are early generation versions, second-hand, some of them at the absolute end of their useful lives. It doesn't seem to me like this is perhaps going to be any particular game changer if it is deployed. And already we could see pressure. There was a rather concerning article which appeared, I think yesterday, from a British, an ex-British Air Force officer, who suggested that what Ukraine needs, and that the only way in which its offensive can succeed, is if the air cover is not air cover provided by these old second-hand F-16s from the 1980s and 1990s, flown by these hastily trained Ukrainian pilots, whether they're operating from Romanian bases or not. The only way that this offensive can succeed is if NATO itself provides the air cover. Now, he does say that there is no appetite for this within NATO, and he's probably right. But anyway, that proposal is there, and we will see whether and how it all develops. So, to summarize, Ukraine is stuck on the battlefields. There is this talk now of deploying fighter jets in the West. I suspect that at some point we could see a Ukrainian attempt to launch a further strike across the Dnieper into the east bank of Kherson region, perhaps towards Crimea as well. It could be that these attacks on the bridges are part of this. And I wonder whether ultimately this offensive, this attack, if it happens at all, that the timetable for it has now been pushed back to the early autumn, when the F-16s finally arrive, in the hope that F-16s based in Romania can provide the air cover of which Ukraine is so desperately short. Anyway, these are the thoughts that I have as of today about this conflict. As I said, the diplomacy at the moment is going nowhere, and my own sense is that the Vilnius summit isn't going anywhere either. It seems that President Erdogan of Turkey is still insisting on his objections to Sweden's membership of NATO, though don't be surprised if that changes by the time the meeting in Vilnius takes place. Anyway, the world is not just Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and the United States. Now, over the last couple of programs, I have discussed at exhaustive length this extraordinary visit by US Secretary of State Blinken to China, the extremely difficult meetings that Secretary Blinken was put through, first with Qin Gang, the Chinese foreign minister, and then with Wang Yi, who is now a member of the Politburo. And despite the more emollient language used by Xi Jinping in the relatively short meeting he had with Blinken, the Chinese message, it seemed to me, was absolutely clear. The Chinese were telling Blinken, look, we are prepared to engage with you, but we're only prepared to do so if you finally start to deliver on what you promised, first and foremost over Taiwan, if you really, truly, and absolutely are dropping your claims, your implicit support for Taiwanese moves towards independence, well, then we might have some discussions with you, but basically it all depends on you. Now, Blinken did succeed in achieving one thing when he was in Beijing, and that was that he did set up this working party. He did get the Chinese to agree to the setting up of this working party. And it's now been suggested, and I think this is probably correct, that Blinken and the Americans who sought this meeting in China, it was they who pushed for this meeting, this visit by Blinken to Beijing, that this is what they were looking for. They wanted to set up this working party in order to use the working party to prepare for a summit meeting of some sort between President Biden and Xi Jinping, perhaps in October. And it's not difficult to understand the political logic. the United States is tied down in Ukraine. We've had more information pouring in about the disastrous state of Western arsenals, NATO arsenals now. We've had more comments. Stoltenberg himself has now admitted that Western arsenals are now, to all intents and purposes, exhausted, which calls into question long-term support for Ukraine. Yet the West has come to believe that with the Ukrainian offensive, unlikely to achieve anything substantive, they're in for a long war with the Russians in Ukraine. So given that this is so, this is not the moment the more rational people in Washington understand for a further conflict with China in the Pacific. So what we have is Blinken sent to Beijing to try to defuse the situation with the Chinese, to try to de-escalate the situation so that the West can, first of all, try to find some way out of this Ukrainian quagmire it's walked into, and at the same time avoids a crisis in the Pacific in the run-up to the presidential election in the United States next year. And setting up this working party, hopefully getting a summit meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping, might conceivably be a way towards achieving that. And Blinken did get his working party. But then, some distance away, at a private residence in Kentfield, California, President Biden made certain quite disastrous comments, which most extraordinarily were published by the White House on its website, enabling the Chinese to read them and to find out all about them, so that the world now knows exactly what it was that President Biden said. And this is a private meeting. It was apparently done, a meeting with donors in advance of the presidential campaign. And the words that have caused all this extraordinary anger in China, the Chinese have already spoken strongly out against them. The words were these, and he says, this is what Biden said: China is real, has real economic difficulties. And the reason why Xi Jinping got very upset in terms of when I shot that balloon down with 2 boxcars full of spy equipment in it is he didn't know it was there. No, I'm serious. That's what's a great embarrassment for dictators, when they didn't know what happened. That wasn't supposed to be going where it was. It was blown off course up through Alaska and then down through the United States, and he didn't know about it. When it got shot down, he was very embarrassed. He denied it was even there. But the very important point is that he's in a situation now when he wants to have a relationship again. Tony Blinken just went over there. Our Secretary of State did a good job, and it's going to take time. But what he was really upset about was that I insisted that we reunite the so-called Quad. He called me and told me not to do that because it was putting him in a bind. I said, all we're doing, we're not trying to surround you. We just trying to make sure the international rules with air and sea lanes remain open, and we're not going to yield to that on that. So now we have India, Australia, Japan, and the United States working hand in glove in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. And that's, by the way, not the only reference to Xi Jinping in these remarks. There's an earlier reference as well, going right to the very start of these comments, the White House's publication of these comments, and I have to say I found it in some ways almost equally bizarre, because it refers to a meeting that Biden claims that he had at some undisclosed point in the past with Xi Jinping, and apparently they were flying over Tibet in some ways, some way. I come at this re-election about what I was, as I was asked by Xi Jinping. I spent a lot of hours with him over the last 12 years. They keep meticulous records, 82 hours worth. Just he and I, 60 some of it in person. I'm not quite sure I understand much of this. But then he supposedly went on to say, and we were in the Tibetan plateau, and he said, "Can you define America for me?" And I said, "Yes, I can. In one word," the government has heard me say this before, in one word, possibilities, possibilities. And he is the first leader, by the way, Xi Jinping is the first leader who Biden mentions in these discussions, in these comments. And it does come across to me very much as if Biden has Xi Jinping on the brain. Now, these are spectacularly ill-judged words, and a lot of people have focused upon the fact that Biden referred to Xi Jinping as a dictator. He spoke about Xi Jinping not knowing where the balloon was, this famous balloon that the US Air Force shot down some months ago. And he says that Xi Jinping didn't know where this balloon was, and that's what's a great embarrassment for dictators, when they don't know what happened. So that means that Xi Jinping is a dictator. And of course that is extremely insulting to Xi Jinping, who, for the record, is not a dictator. I mean, you might consider the Chinese political system to be authoritarian, many do, but Xi Jinping is not the absolute ruler of China or a dictator of China. He has to work through the Standing Committee of the Politburo and the other agencies of the Chinese Communist Party and of the Chinese government, and he is certainly not a dictator. He can't simply get up and make a decision and expect everybody to do as he tells them. Anybody who knows anything about China knows that that isn't how it works. So anyway, calling Xi Jinping a dictator, even in this slightly indirect way, was deeply insulting to the Chinese, deeply insulting to Xi Jinping himself. And of course, it's not the only time that Biden has said rude things about Xi Jinping. A few months ago, time of his State of the Union address, Biden went off script, appeared rather angry, and asked rhetorically which world leader would want to change places with Xi Jinping, which I thought was both most odd question to ask and an extraordinarily intemperate one, and in some ways, I think, a somewhat rude one, though not anything like as rude as the one that we've just heard, where Xi Jinping is in effect called a dictator. But I don't think that's the only thing that the Chinese will have been annoyed about from these comments. Because first of all, it makes claims about Xi Jinping and the balloon incident, which to me seem frankly bizarre. First of all, Biden appears to say that Xi Jinping didn't know where the balloon was when it was shot down. Now that is incredible, that is ridiculous. The entire international media, and the Chinese media as well, were talking about the whereabouts of this balloon, that it was over the United States, and that it had been blown off course and floating over the United States. And Xi Jinping certainly knew where it was, and he certainly knew when it was shot down. I mean, the idea that Xi Jinping was ignorant of these things is, on its face, absurd. What Biden is acknowledging here, however, is something quite different, which is that this balloon was blown off course and had not been intended to cross the United States, which is, of course, exactly what the Chinese were saying at the time. Now, he still insists that it was a spy balloon with 2 boxcars full of spy equipment. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. The Chinese still insist it was a weather balloon. But the Chinese also said at the time that it had not been intended to fly across the United States, that it was blown off course. The US, or many people in the US, pretended or claimed otherwise or insinuated otherwise. Biden now admits that, but he turns it round. He appears to say, yes, the balloon was indeed flown off course, but instead of us being wrong about this, on the contrary, it's the Chinese who are embarrassed. Even though they were telling the truth, they're embarrassed because it demonstrates their lack of control. And when Biden says that he, which is to say Xi Jinping, denied it was even there, well, all I will say is that is not true at all, in accordance with my recollection of the incident. And then we have the next thing, that Biden goes on to say that Xi Jinping is in a situation now where he wants to have a relationship again. Tony Blinken just went over there. Our Secretary of State did a good job, and it's going to take time. Well, again, that turns reality on its head, because it was not the Chinese who sought this trip by Blinken to China. It was the United States which sought this trip by Blinken to China. As I said, there's rumours, which I personally think are probably true, that in order to get the discussions reopened, the United States sent William Burns, the CIA director, on a secret trip to Beijing to try to persuade the Chinese to agree to have Blinken come. So again, what the Chinese are going to be seeing in this is that Biden is turning things round. He's making it look as if the Chinese were worried about the fact that they didn't have a relationship with the United States and were looking to reopen it, whereas, of course, the reality is the diametric opposite. And then, of course, we have these extraordinary comments about reuniting the Quad, and he says that his purpose is to make sure the international rules with air and sea lanes remain open. Now, the Chinese are not fools. They know that this isn't the case at all. They know perfectly well that the United States is trying to build up the Quad as some kind of anti-Chinese alliance in East Asia. But then we have this extraordinary claim that Xi Jinping, at some point, we're not exactly told by Biden when this is supposed to have happened, but the implication is that it happened quite recently, that Xi Jinping supposedly telephoned Biden and said that this was putting him, which is to say Xi Jinping, in a bind, and that Biden said that we're not going to yield on that. It's only about ensuring the international rules with air and sea lanes remain open. Now, I'm deeply skeptical that this conversation ever took place. As I said, I'm not familiar with any recent conversation between Xi Jinping and Biden. I've never seen anything like that in any readout, either published by the United States or by China, of any of the discussions that have taken place between Xi Jinping and Biden. Anything that could be construed as being in any way like that comment, you're putting me in a bind. And I can't frankly believe that Xi Jinping would have said such a thing to Biden of all people. Perhaps some kind of exchange on this topic did take place. Perhaps Xi Jinping said that the Chinese see these attempts by the US to create these alliances against them in the Pacific as deeply unfriendly, indeed hostile act, in which case that would be no different from what the Chinese are saying publicly. But in that case also, Biden is misrepresenting the discussions. So, all of this, as the United States seems to be trying to get a summit meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping up and running. It's not surprising that the Chinese are furious, and they must be asking themselves, what is the point of doing so when the person that they have to deal with, the President of the United States, engages in this kind of quicksilver talk? You appear to agree with him one thing, and he turns round and pretends that something entirely different was said, and is happy to recreate the narrative of events in the way that it must seem to the Chinese that Biden was doing in these comments. And the fact that Biden is also being so rude about Xi Jinping, calling him a dictator as well, that must make the Chinese even more skeptical about whether there's any point in going ahead with this summit meeting, which apparently Biden and the US want. Now, I'm not going to try and speculate about what the Chinese are going to try to do. I understand that the State Department is working overtime, trying to reassure the Chinese that these comments made to donors of the Democratic Party and President Biden's presidential re-election campaign were not intended seriously. I don't know what the Chinese will make of that. But anyway, one way or the other, I think it's too early to anticipate Chinese moves, though the strong reaction from Chinese officials, including the Chinese foreign policy spokesman, shows that they are extremely angry. Much more interesting question is why these comments were made by President Biden at all. Now, note that they were made over the course of a private meeting in a private residence in California. I don't know which, but it was a hotel private residence, Kentfield, California. So what was the point then of publicizing these comments? Because that is what the White House has done. They've all been published, and I've been reading the comments from the White House website. It doesn't look to me as if this was simply something that was done without real understanding or thought. Now, it could be that the administration is trying to engage in some kind of domestic damage limitation. The administration has been much criticized for these supposed concessions to the Chinese over Taiwan, even though, as I discussed yesterday, what Blinken said about Taiwan was merely a restatement of what is official US policy and has been so ever since the 1970s. But it could be that the White House, looking forward to the election, thought that some degree of damage limitation needed to be done, so that's why they published these comments. I have to say that I think that there is another possibility, and it is an uncomfortable one, and that is that the president himself wanted these comments published because he is himself extremely frustrated and angry about the way things have turned out. It could be that he has his own feelings about these recent events, about the way in which, for example, the meetings in China went, about the way in which the meeting with the meetings between Blinken and the Chinese officials went. Bear in mind that these meetings between Blinken, the meeting between Blinken and Xin Gang took place on the 18th of June. The meeting between Blinken and Wang Yi took place on the 19th of June, and it could be that, and the meeting between Xi Jinping and Blinken also took place on the 19th of June. So Biden would presumably have received reports about all of these meetings. He's known to be short-tempered. He's got strong, visceral feelings about Xi Jinping, as we saw with that bizarre set of comments he made about him over the course of the State of the Union address. And on the following day, he goes, speaks to the donors. He makes clear his exasperation. He calls Xi Jinping a dictator, and he tries to cover up or rather conceal the Chinese lectures to his Secretary of State, to Blinken, by somehow turning everything on its head, pretending that it's Xi Jinping who feels humiliated over the balloon incident, that it's Xi Jinping who wants to resume the discussions, that it's Xi Jinping who has agreed to the things that Blinken wanted, and that it's Xi Jinping who is nervous about the moves the administration is making with respect to the Quad. I have to say that would be completely in character for me, and it would also be completely in character with respect to Blinken, that he would want to make that all public by having these statements published. Anyway, this bizarre episode tells us something about how difficult it is to conduct discussions with the United States generally, but with this particular administration. The president sends his Secretary of State, and before that, apparently, his CIA director, to establish bridges to Beijing. The CIA director gets the Chinese to agree to the Secretary of State going through a series of difficult meetings with the Chinese, but he does come out with a working party, and perhaps there's hopes of a summit meeting with the Chinese leader in October. These difficult meetings the Secretary of State has take place on the 18th and 19th of June. On the following day, 20th of June, the President himself, apparently seething and angry, comes out with these extraordinary statements. He says the Chinese leader is a dictator and an embarrassed and humiliated man who is trying to court the United States. He is the person who wants to have good relations with the United States. It's not the United States that wants to have relations with him. And when Biden talks about Xi Jinping feeling humiliated and embarrassed, I wonder whether this isn't a case of projection, whether these comments were made because Biden himself, it is Biden himself who feels in some way humiliated and embarrassed about the way in which Blinken was treated in Beijing. Well, possibly. After all, the British ambassador, Ivor Roberts, in that article in the Daily Telegraph, which I discussed yesterday, also said that the United States had been humiliated by China in these meetings in Beijing. But the fact is, if you're the President of the United States, you need to put your feelings aside and you need to focus instead on the policy that you want to pursue. At the moment, you want to de-escalate tensions with China. The comments the President has made must make the Chinese wonder, however, whether there's any point, because clearly your feelings are so strong that you can't discipline them and you can't therefore be trusted to conduct a coherent foreign policy. Well, that's all I'm going to say about this bizarre incident. We'll see what the Chinese do. But in the meantime, this is where I end this long video. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Also remember, you can go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again, more from me soon, and have a very good day.